I was gasping for air on my mother's expensive hardwood floor, my throat closing completely. Instead of helping me, she stepped over my trembling body, adjusted her pearls, and snapped, "Quit faking it and get in the kitchen." My father scoffed, calling me a lazy embarrassment. They were perfectly content to let me die right there just to save face at their fancy dinner party. But then a handsome stranger knelt beside me, checked my pulse, and screamed for an ambulance. The room froze. And in that moment, I realized I was not just going to survive this, I was going to destroy them. My name is Gwendolyn, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a family who saw your pain as an inconvenience. The dinner party was supposed to be a grand celebration for my brother-in-law, DeAndre. He had just landed a massive promotion as an investment fund manager, and my mother, Beatrice, wanted the entire city to know. She hosted the event at her sprawling suburban estate, inviting local politicians, wealthy neighbors, and high society friends to flaunt her perfect golden family. My sister Felicity paraded DeAndre around the living room like a trophy. DeAndre, a tall and striking African-American man, in a custom-tailored suit, soaked up the attention with incredible arrogance. He boasted loudly about his new salary and their upcoming luxury vacations to Europe, completely ignoring anyone he deemed beneath his new social status. My brother Cameron was busy chatting with his +1, an emergency room doctor named Mitchell Reed. I was only invited because they needed someone to serve the appetizers and refill the champagne glasses. They never missed a single chance to treat me like the hired help. In their minds, I was still the useless college dropout they had kicked out of the house a decade ago for refusing to follow my father's rigid career plans. They firmly believed I was struggling to pay rent in some run-down apartment, working minimum wage jobs just to survive. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent those years teaching myself advanced coding and algorithms. They did not know I was the founder and chief executive officer of a medical data analytics firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I kept my enormous success a closely guarded secret, because sharing anything with my family only invited sabotage, manipulation, and endless greed. After 2 hours of carrying heavy silver trays and being treated like a servant by my own blood relatives, I retreated to a quiet corner of the dining room for a quick break. I was exhausted and starving. I took a small bite of the catered salad my mother had placed on the side table, assuming it was safe. Almost instantly, my lips began to tingle. A sharp burning sensation crawled down my throat, feeling like broken glass sliding down my windpipe. My airway constricted with terrifying speed, shutting off the oxygen completely. Panic seized my chest as my hands flew to my neck. I knew exactly what was happening. Pistachios. I am severely allergic to tree nuts. This was a documented medical fact my mother Beatrice had known since I was 4 years old. Yet she had deliberately ordered a salad covered in crushed pistachios, likely assuming I would not be allowed to eat the guest food anyway, or simply not caring enough to remember. I dropped my fork. The sharp clatter of silver against the porcelain plate drew a few annoyed glances from the nearby wealthy guests. I stumbled forward, clutching my throat desperately, trying to draw a single breath. My lungs burned with the effort. I bumped into a heavy mahogany chair, knocking it over with a loud thud that instantly silenced the entire room. My mother marched over, her face twisted in absolute fury. She did not ask if I was choking. She did not check if I was breathing. She simply grabbed my arm and dragged me forcefully away from her important friends. "Stop making a scene, Gwendolyn," she hissed, pushing me toward the hallway. "Enough drama. You are ruining DeAndre's big night. Get in the kitchen and clean up those appetizer trays right now." I collapsed onto the floor, my knees hitting the expensive Persian rug. My lungs screamed for oxygen that would not come. I reached a shaking hand toward her, my vision blurring at the edges as the room began to spin. My father Donovan stepped forward, looking down at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Get up," he sneered, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. "Stop being lazy. If you want to throw a tantrum, do it outside. You are a complete embarrassment to this family." I was suffocating. Black spots danced aggressively across my vision. I could hear Felicity laughing from across the room, telling a prominent local judge to ignore her dramatic sister because I was always acting out for attention. I felt my body going completely limp, the last reserves of my strength fading away. Then someone shoved aggressively past my father. It was Cameron's guest, Dr. Mitchell Reed. He dropped to his knees beside me, completely ignoring his expensive suit as it hit the hardwood floor. He grabbed my wrist, feeling for a pulse, and his face instantly drained of all color. "What is wrong with her?" he demanded, tilting my chin up to open my airway. "She is faking an allergy attack to steal the spotlight," Beatrice snapped, tapping her heel impatiently against the floor. "She has always been a jealous liar." Mitchell pulled a small penlight from his jacket pocket and checked my dilated pupils. His professional demeanor kicked into high gear. "She is not faking," he yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and shattering their perfect illusion. "She is in severe anaphylactic shock. Her airway is completely closed. Call 911 right now." For one terrible second, the room went dead silent. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. The soft jazz music playing in the background suddenly sounded deafening. Then sheer panic exploded. Guests began shouting and stepping over each other. DeAndre backed away, looking terrified that a medical emergency might ruin his celebration and draw negative attention. Mitchell tore off his jacket, positioning my head carefully while shouting instructions to the panicked crowd, demanding an EpiPen that no one in my careless family had bothered to keep around. I could barely process what was happening. The lack of oxygen was dragging me down into a dark, heavy void. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until red and blue lights flashed frantically through the large living room windows. Paramedics rushed through the front doors with a stretcher and a heavy medical bag. As they hoisted my limp body onto the gurney, the darkness finally pulled me under. But right before I lost consciousness entirely, I heard my mother's voice cutting through the chaos. She was not asking the paramedics if her daughter was going to live. She was not crying or holding my hand. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at the floor and yelled, "Be careful with those boots! She is already ruining my expensive Persian rug, do not make it worse." The darkness peeled away in heavy, agonizing layers. My mind surfaced before my body did, leaving me trapped in a terrifying state of paralysis. I was lying on a stiff hospital bed. The rhythmic hum and regular hiss of a ventilator filled the room, pushing air into my lungs through a rigid tube down my throat. My eyelids fluttered open just a fraction. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit burned my retinas. I tried to lift my hand to rip the tube out, but my limbs felt like they were filled with wet cement. The sedatives and the sheer physical trauma of the anaphylactic shock kept me pinned to the mattress. I was a prisoner in my own body, unable to move, unable to speak, but completely conscious. Through the narrow gap of the sliding glass door to my room, voices drifted in. Sharp, angry voices that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline straight to my heart. "She is not dying, she is throwing a tantrum." "My mother," Beatrice hissed. Her voice was unmistakable, carrying that same country club arrogance she used to belittle service workers. "I want her placed on a mandatory psychiatric hold immediately. She has always been a chronic attention seeker. She faked this entire episode because her brother-in-law was getting praised tonight and she could not stand being invisible." A calm, authoritative voice responded. It was Dr. Mitchell Reed, the man who had knelt beside me on the dining room floor. "Mrs. Thorne, your daughter did not fake anything. She went into stage 4 anaphylaxis. Her airway was entirely swollen shut. If I had not administered emergency epinephrine and established a surgical airway in your foyer, she would be in the morgue right now. She ingested a lethal amount of pistachio dust." "Then she must have sprinkled it on her own salad," Beatrice snapped back without missing a beat. "I am telling you, doctor, the girl is deeply disturbed. She dropped out of college. She vanished from our lives. She works menial jobs and resents her sister's success. As her mother, I am ordering you to transfer her to the psychiatric ward the second she is stabilized." "You do not have the authority to order anything," Mitchell replied, his tone dropping an octave. "She is a 33-year-old woman. Unless you possess a legal medical proxy, her care is entirely between her and this hospital. Now, excuse me, I need to check on my patient. Wait. That was DeAndre. His voice lacked its usual booming confidence. He sounded frantic, breathless, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Doctor, please, we are just concerned family. We will go down to administration and sort out the proxy paperwork right now. Give us 10 minutes. Footsteps receded as Mitchell apparently walked away to deal with another nurse. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the heavy silence that followed. But the silence did not last. Beatrice and DeAndre had not left the hallway. They had simply moved closer to the glass partition of my room, assuming I was completely unconscious. "What are you doing?" Beatrice whispered harshly. "Why are you sweating like a pig? You are ruining the optics. Get it together, DeAndre." "Beatrice, you need to listen to me right now," DeAndre urged, his voice trembling with a frantic, unhinged energy. "You need to get that medical proxy form signed by the hospital administrator immediately. I do not care who you have to bribe or what lies you have to tell them about her mental state. You get legal control over her body today." "Why the sudden panic?" Beatrice demanded. "Let her rot in the psych ward. It keeps her out of my hair." "Because if she wakes up and leaves this hospital, I am finished," DeAndre snapped. I strained my ears, focusing all my energy on the conversation just feet away from my bed. "If she wakes up, the first thing she is going to do is run a background check on her own credit." DeAndre continued his words, spilling out in a panicked rush. "You know exactly what we did 5 years ago when you kicked her out. We used her social security number. If she pulls her credit report, the Federal Banking Commission will see the fraudulent mortgage we took out for Felicity's mansion. They will trace the shell companies. I will lose my broker license. I will go to federal prison, Beatrice. And you and Donovan will go down right beside me for wire fraud." I felt my heart rate spike, the monitor next to my bed beeping a little faster. 5 years ago, my parents had kicked me out of the house with nothing but a suitcase, mocking me for refusing to marry a wealthy partner of their choosing. I had spent years assuming they had simply cut me off. Now, lying paralyzed in a hospital bed, the sickening truth washed over me. They had not just abandoned me. They had stolen my identity. My own sister's luxurious lifestyle, the very mansion she flaunted online, was financed through massive bank fraud, chained directly to my name. "Keep your voice down," Beatrice hissed, her tone shifting from arrogant to terrified. "The bank told us those accounts were secured. She is just a waitress. She does not even have a bank account to monitor." "It does not matter," DeAndre fired back. "The audit algorithms are getting tighter. We cannot risk her answering any financial background questions if the hospital billing department runs her social security number. You need to get that proxy. You need to keep her sedated. Put her in a coma if you have to. Better yet, tell them she has a do not resuscitate order. Just pull the plug, Beatrice. If she wakes up, we all go to jail." The sheer malice in his voice sent a chill straight to my bones. They were not just greedy. They were actively plotting to murder me to cover up a federal crime. I heard Beatrice take a sharp breath, processing the reality of the threat. "I will get the hospital administrator," Beatrice said, her voice turning ice cold. "We will claim she has a history of severe delusion and suicidal ideation. They will give me emergency temporary guardianship. I will make sure she never speaks to anyone." Their footsteps hurried away down the linoleum corridor, rushing off to secure the legal paperwork that would effectively end my life. I was trapped. The medication was heavy in my veins, but the adrenaline pumping through my system was fighting a brutal war against the sedatives. I tried to thrash, tried to bite down on the breathing tube, desperately trying to trigger an alarm. The sliding glass door glided open. Dr. Mitchell Reed stepped into the room. He approached the monitors, tapping a few buttons on the screen to silence the alarms. He looked down at his clipboard, making notes, his face a mask of professional exhaustion. I poured every ounce of willpower I possessed into my right hand. I managed to twitch my index finger. It brushed against the metal bed rail. Mitchell stopped writing. He looked down at my hand, then slowly raised his eyes to my face. My eyelids were open. I stared directly into his eyes, my chest heaving against the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. I could not speak, but my eyes screamed for help. Mitchell froze. He looked over his shoulder, checking the empty hallway. He stepped closer to the bed, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. "You are awake," he whispered. "The paralytic should still be in effect." I blinked twice, a desperate confirmation. Mitchell studied my eyes. He had been standing right outside the door. He knew exactly who was pacing the halls. He knew Beatrice was trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He saw the sheer, unadulterated terror and rage burning in my expression. "Did you hear them?" he asked softly. I blinked twice again. Yes. Mitchell did not call for a nurse. He did not alert the administration. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his white coat. He pulled out a black pen and a small prescription notepad. He checked the hallway one more time, then gently slid the pen and the notepad under my trembling fingers, hiding them beneath the thin hospital blanket. "They are coming back with the administrator in 5 minutes to sign away your rights," Mitchell whispered, his voice incredibly steady. "If you can write, do it now. Tell me who to call." Using my executive clearance, I accessed the Federal Banking Commission's automated fraud portal. My company regularly interfaced with these federal databases for compliance audits, giving me direct, unfiltered access to freeze compromised accounts instantly. I highlighted the fraudulent mortgage, linked it to DeAndre's brokerage license number, and tagged the entire financial cluster as a Level 1 identity theft breach. I did not stop there. I placed a hard, immediate freeze on the core asset accounts tied to the mansion. Every line of credit, every equity loan, every single dollar associated with that property was instantly locked by federal mandate. With one final keystroke, I initiated an automatic red flag report, sending the raw data directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The digital trap snapped shut with a quiet click of my enter key. DeAndre's career, Felicity's mansion, and my parents' pristine reputation were now officially ticking time bombs. The fallout would be swift, brutal, and completely out of their control. I leaned back against the hospital pillows, the cold sweat on my forehead drying. The satisfaction of the trap closing was intoxicating. Lincoln pulled out his phone, ready to coordinate with our corporate security team to handle the inevitable legal shockwave. Suddenly, loud shouting echoed from the hallway. The heavy thud of a physical struggle vibrated through the floorboards. I could hear my private security detail issuing stern warnings, but the voice screaming back was shrill and completely unhinged. The heavy intensive care unit door flew open, hitting the wall stopper with a violent crash. Felicity violently shoved past the hospital security, her designer dress wrinkled and her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands around her face. She was panting heavily, her eyes wide with manic fury, storming directly into my room with a crumpled piece of paper gripped tightly in her fist. My fingers gripped the smooth plastic barrel of the pen Mitchell slipped into my hand. It felt impossibly heavy. The paralytic drug still clouded my nervous system, turning my veins to lead, but pure survival instinct forced my muscles to obey. I pressed the tip of the pen against the small notepad hidden under my blanket. My hand shook violently, the ink tearing through the thin paper, but I managed to scribble a single name and an emergency phone number. Lincoln Vance. I shoved the crumpled paper back toward Dr. Mitchell Reed, just as the heavy wooden door to my intensive care room swung open with a violent thud. Mitchell slipped the paper into his pocket with practiced ease, seamlessly smoothing his expression into a mask of clinical detachment. My mother Beatrice marched into the room with her chin held high, radiating absolute authority. Her designer heels clicked aggressively against the linoleum, a sharp, rhythmic sound that demanded immediate obedience from everyone in her path. Right behind her was my father Donovan, and a man I did not recognize. The stranger wore a cheap suit and a nervous sweat, clutching a clipboard tightly to his chest like a shield. Beatrice did not ask how I was feeling. She did not even glance at the heart monitor tracking my erratic pulse. She stepped right up to the side of my bed, leaned over me, and roughly snatched the oxygen mask off my face. "Stop the theatrics right now, Gwendolyn," she ordered. "You caused enough of a scene at the party. You ruined the entire evening for your sister and her husband. Everyone was talking about your little collapse instead of DeAndre's promotion. Now we have to clean up your ridiculous mess before our guests start asking uncomfortable questions about why you are even here." Donovan stepped forward and ripped the clipboard from the sweaty administrator. He shoved it down onto my chest, pinning the heavy paper against my collarbone with unnecessary force. "Sign this immediately," Donovan demanded, tapping a thick finger against the bottom of the page. "The hospital requires a signature for an emergency psychiatric hold. You are a danger to yourself, you are mentally unstable, and you clearly need constant supervision. We are taking over your medical proxy before you do something even more embarrassing to this family. You have always been a liability, and I am done letting your little episodes humiliate us." The administrator shuffled his feet, looking anywhere but at me. He was clearly intimidated by my parents and their perceived wealth, entirely willing to bend the rules to accommodate their demands. "As your next of kin, your parents have the right to assume temporary guardianship if you are incapacitated," he mumbled, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Just sign at the bottom line, miss. We can make this all go smoothly and get you moved to a quiet room on the psychiatric floor." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and swollen from the anaphylaxis. I could only manage a raspy, painful wheeze. Through the doorway, I could see DeAndre hovering in the hallway. He was pacing back and forth, watching me with cold, desperate eyes. He gave Beatrice a frantic nod, signaling her to hurry up and secure the signature. He needed me silenced and heavily sedated before I could access my own financial data and uncover the massive fraud he had committed using my identity. "Give her the pen," Beatrice snapped at Mitchell, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "Stop coddling her. She has been a dramatic, rebellious child since she was a teenager, and it is time her father and I took permanent control of her life. She does not know what is best for her." Mitchell crossed his arms and stood his ground, stepping firmly between my parents and the hospital bed. "She is heavily medicated and legally unable to sign any binding documents, Mrs. Thorne. I will not allow you to force a patient into a psychiatric hold under these conditions. Her cognitive function is impaired by the sedatives, and this entire process is highly unethical." Donovan pointed a thick finger right back at Mitchell, his face turning red with rage. "You are just a guest of my son. Do not interfere with family business, or I will call the hospital board and have your medical license revoked before breakfast. You have no idea who you are dealing with. We are prominent donors in this city, and you are just an emergency room glorified mechanic." The door opened again. But this time, it was not a nurse coming to check my vitals. Two men in tailored dark suits stepped into the room. They had earpieces and the unmistakable build of elite private security. They smoothly flanked the doorway, moving with military precision, using their bodies to force DeAndre to step back into the hall and physically blocking anyone else from entering. Then a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and an impeccable navy suit walked directly past my mother and father. It was Lincoln. He did not even look at them. He walked straight to the foot of my bed, completely ignoring the chaos, and gave me a crisp, reassuring nod. "Good evening, Gwendolyn," he said, his voice completely calm and commanding, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I received a rather urgent phone call from Dr. Reed regarding your safety. It seems we have a pest problem in this room." Beatrice let out a sharp, offended gasp, clutching her pearls in mock horror. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my daughter's room right now. We are executing a medical proxy and we do not need strangers intruding on a private family medical crisis." Lincoln turned slowly to face my father. He reached inside his breast pocket, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, and slapped them directly onto Donovan's chest, right over the clipboard my father was still trying to force me to sign. "You are executing absolutely nothing," Lincoln said, his tone razor-sharp and unyielding. "My name is Lincoln Vance. I am Miss Thorne's primary legal counsel. And as of 10 seconds ago, you are in direct violation of a federal restraining order and a preemptive medical power of attorney that my client signed with my firm over 3 years ago." Donovan looked at the papers and laughed out loud, a harsh, booming sound that echoed off the sterile walls. "Legal counsel," he sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "What an absolute joke. How exactly is a college dropout waitress paying for a suit like him? Are you paying his hourly rate in spilled coffee and loose change?" Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "This is exactly why we need the psychiatric hold, Donovan. She is completely delusional. She cannot afford a parking ticket, let alone a top-tier corporate attorney. We kicked her out 5 years ago because she refused to work a real job and follow the path we laid out for her. She has been a useless burden on this family her entire life, and now she is hiring actors to play lawyers just to get attention. Lincoln did not raise his voice, but the sheer authority in his tone made the room temperature drop. The document you are holding strips you of all rights to make any medical, financial, or personal decisions regarding my client. If you or your son-in-law attempt to access her hospital records again, my security team will physically remove you from the premises and I will press federal charges for attempted medical fraud. Donovan's face turned a violent shade of purple. He opened his mouth to scream another insult, ready to tear the documents in half, but I finally found the strength to push the heavy clipboard off my chest. It clattered loudly to the linoleum floor, scattering the useless psychiatric forms across the tiles. I reached up with a shaking hand and pulled the oxygen mask completely away from my face. I looked directly at my father, my voice hoarse but completely steady, filled with a quiet, dangerous power. I do not pay him with waitress tips, Dad. I let my gaze drift slowly past my parents, ignoring their shocked expressions, and landed squarely on DeAndre, who was still hovering in the hallway, his face slick with genuine panic. And I know exactly why DeAndre is sweating. Felicity slammed the crumpled paper onto the foot of my hospital bed. It was a printed alert from their private wealth management concierge. The bold red text at the top read, "Emergency hold assets frozen by federal mandate." She pointed a manicured finger at my face, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "You think you can hack into our accounts and scare us?" Felicity shrieked, her voice vibrating with a shrill, piercing intensity that made the heart monitor spike. "You are completely delusional, Gwendolyn. My husband is a top-tier investment manager at one of the most powerful firms in the country. We have millions in diversified portfolios. We are absolutely untouchable. You are nothing but a jealous, pathetic waitress playing on a stolen laptop." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply turned the heavy, encrypted laptop screen toward her, letting the cascading lines of federal banking codes illuminate her furious face. "I did not hack your accounts, Felicity. I flagged my own social security number for severe identity theft. The exact same social security number your husband used to fraudulently secure the premium mortgage on your precious luxury mansion. I initiated a Level 1 federal freeze on your core asset accounts exactly 10 minutes ago. Every dollar of equity you have, every line of credit, every single investment portfolio tied to that fraudulent property is currently locked in a federal holding pattern." Felicity laughed hysterically, a sharp, breathless sound devoid of any real humor. "You are lying. DeAndre's firm handles all our underwriting. They protect their top earners from garbage claims like this. I am calling him right now to prove what a psychotic liar you are." She pulled out her phone aggressively, jabbing the screen to hit speed dial. Out of sheer arrogance, she slapped the speakerphone button so I could hear her husband put me in my place, but the voice that answered the call was not confident. It was DeAndre, and he was hyperventilating, gasping for air, like a drowning man thrashing against a violent current. "Felicity, where are you?" he wheezed, the sound of blaring car horns and city street traffic echoing loudly in the background. "The bank just called my cell. The accounts are completely locked. I cannot even access my checking account to buy a bottle of water. Everything is gone." "DeAndre, calm down!" Felicity ordered, her own voice beginning to tremble as the reality of his sheer panic set in. "It is just Gwendolyn playing some stupid computer trick at the hospital. Call your firm's legal department immediately and tell them to fix it. They will protect us." I glanced at the silver watch on Lincoln's wrist, silently calculating the time since I had hit the execute command on the federal banking portal. "They will not protect him," I stated, my voice slicing effortlessly through the frantic speakerphone audio. "Check his corporate email, Felicity. He was terminated with cause exactly 4 minutes ago." Before Felicity could even process the immense weight of those words, the hospital hallway erupted into a fresh wave of chaotic shouting. The heavy door flew open again, completely bypassing the wall stopper and slamming loudly against the drywall. DeAndre burst into the room. He did not look like an untouchable top-tier investment manager. His expensive silk tie was torn open, his collar was soaked in nervous sweat, and his eyes were wild with sheer, unadulterated panic. He must have sprinted all the way from the financial district. He saw me sitting up in the hospital bed with the laptop resting on my knees, and he lost whatever fragile shred of sanity he had left. With a guttural roar, he lunged forward, his hands outstretched like claws aiming directly for my throat. He clearly intended to physically destroy the machine and me along with it. He did not even make it 2 steps. Lincoln's security detail moved with terrifying practice speed. 2 massive men in dark suits intercepted DeAndre mid-stride. One grabbed his right shoulder, the other hooked his waist, and together they slammed him violently face first into the thick drywall. The heavy impact rattled the medical equipment and shook the floorboards. They pinned his arms behind his back, completely immobilizing him, as he thrashed and kicked uselessly against the linoleum. "Let me go!" DeAndre screamed, his face pressed painfully against the white paint, his voice muffled but filled with absolute terror. "Do you have any idea what you just did to me, Gwendolyn? My firm fired me. Corporate security escorted me out of the building in front of my entire trading floor like a common criminal. The Federal Bureau of Investigation just flagged my broker's license for severe identity theft and federal wire fraud. My entire career is over. I am going to federal prison because of your petty little revenge." "You are going to federal prison because you committed federal wire fraud, DeAndre," I replied, closing the laptop with a quiet, decisive click. "You stole my identity because you thought I was too poor and too disconnected to ever find out. You built your entire lavish lifestyle on a foundation of felony theft." The crushing reality of his situation finally obliterated DeAndre's arrogant bravado. The aggressive posturing evaporated instantly, replaced by the cowardly, pathetic desperation of a cornered animal. He stopped struggling against the security guards and began to sob, a high-pitched, wretched sound that filled the intensive care room. "It was not my idea," he wailed, turning his head as much as the guard's iron grip would allow. "I did not want to do it. It was their idea. They made me do it." Felicity dropped her phone onto the floor, the screen cracking against the tiles. "DeAndre, what are you talking about?" she stammered, her hands flying to her mouth in horror. "Your parents." DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria, completely willing to sacrifice his own family to save himself. "Donovan and Beatrice. They came to me when we needed the massive down payment for the mansion. They told me Gwendolyn had a completely blank credit history. They were the ones who handed me her social security number on a silver platter. They told me to forge the guarantor documents and push the loan through my firm. They said she was a nobody. They explicitly promised me she was a nobody who would never notice and never matter." The heavy hospital door, which had been left slightly ajar after DeAndre's violent entrance, was slowly pushed all the way open. Standing right on the threshold were Beatrice and Donovan. Lincoln had apparently instructed his security team to stand down and allow them back up to the intensive care floor, just in time to witness the execution of my digital trap. My parents stood frozen in the doorway, their faces drained of all color, having heard every single word of DeAndre's panicked, cowardly confession. They looked at the massive security guards pinning their golden son-in-law to the wall. They looked at Felicity, who was trembling and staring at her husband in absolute disgust. And finally, their terrified eyes locked onto me. The realization washed over their faces in real time, shifting their expressions from arrogant superiority to genuine suffocating dread. I was not the helpless, discarded daughter anymore. I had systematically cornered them all, and the trap was securely locked. The suffocating dread on my parents' faces lasted for exactly 5 seconds. In any normal family, being caught red-handed, orchestrating a massive federal fraud against your own child would trigger apologies, shame, or at least a desperate plea for forgiveness. But my mother was not a normal woman. I watched the fear in Beatrice's eyes harden, crystallizing into a mask of ugly, self-righteous indignation. She straightened her posture, brushing an invisible speck of dust off her designer blazer, and marched right past the security guards. She completely ignored DeAndre, who was still pinned against the wall, weeping openly. "You ungrateful little brat!" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of anger and entitlement. You sit there looking so smug, acting like you are the victim here. You owed us that credit history, Gwendolyn. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We fed you. We clothed you. We paid for your existence. When you refused to follow the path we laid out for your life, you forfeited any right to that social security number. It was a blank slate sitting there doing absolutely nothing while your sister needed a home. Donovan stepped into the room right behind her, nodding in fervent agreement. We did what families do, he barked, pointing a thick finger at my hospital bed. We utilized an available asset to secure Felicity's future. You were living in a car. You did not need a $500,000 mortgage. You should be thanking us for keeping your credit profile active. The sheer psychological gymnastics required to justify federal identity theft as a parenting tax was staggering. I did not scream, I did not argue. I simply looked at Lincoln and gave him a single brief nod. Lincoln understood immediately. He snapped his fingers and his security team moved with ruthless efficiency. They hauled DeAndre off the wall and marched him toward the door, physically corralling Beatrice Donovan and Felicity along with him. My parents shouted threats and insults demanding I drop the federal freeze, but the heavy intensive care door clicked shut, cutting off their toxic noise and leaving me in peace. But I knew they would not go down quietly. Narcissists never retreat when cornered, they simply change the narrative. The very next morning, I was sitting up in my hospital bed, sipping tea, and reviewing the overnight financial reports Lincoln had pulled for me. The local morning news was playing softly on the television, mounted near the ceiling. I was half listening until a familiar, overly manicured face flashed across the screen. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. There, sitting on a plush velvet couch in a local television studio, were Beatrice and Donovan. Flanking them was Felicity, looking pale and clutching a tissue. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. The chyron flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Local family terrorized by estranged daughter." "We are just completely devastated," Beatrice told the sympathetic news anchor, perfectly executing a voice crack as she dabbed at a non-existent tear. "Our youngest daughter, Gwendolyn, has suffered from severe mental instability for years. We tried everything to help her, but she cut ties with us. And now she has suffered a complete psychological breakdown. She hacked into her brother-in-law's investment firm and is using some sort of computer virus to freeze all of our family assets." Donovan wrapped a protective arm around Felicity, who let out a pathetic, trembling sob. "She is trying to render her own sister homeless out of pure, bitter jealousy," Donovan stated gravely, staring directly into the camera. "She knows Felicity is pregnant with her first child and the stress is putting the baby at risk. She is trying to take the roof from over a pregnant woman's head." I stared at the screen, my expression flat. A pregnancy. Felicity had not mentioned a word about a baby yesterday, but it was the absolute perfect public relations shield. They were weaponizing an unborn child to cast me as a deranged, jealous monster while entirely burying the fact that they had committed felony wire fraud. Lincoln walked into the room just as the broadcast cut to commercial. He did not look amused. He handed me a sleek digital tablet. "The television interview was just the opening salvo," Lincoln said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. "Your sister has mobilized her entire high society network. Look at social media." I looked down at the tablet. Felicity had launched a massive coordinated smear campaign across every platform. She was rallying her country club friends, her thousands of Instagram followers, and local community groups, painting herself as the pregnant victim of a cyber-stalking sister. But the internet mob requires a physical target, and Felicity had given them one. She had directed all of their digital rage toward a small, struggling design firm downtown. I remembered the firm well. I had applied for a receptionist job there 5 years ago, right after my parents threw me onto the street. I had used it as a mailing address on a few early tax forms before I secured my own apartment, which meant that in some outdated public directory, my name was loosely associated with the firm's physical address. Felicity, in her frantic, unhinged rush to destroy me, had done a cheap background check, found the old link, and assumed I currently owned the company. The cancel culture attack was brutal and swift. I watched in real time as the firm's business pages were flooded with thousands of hateful comments. Felicity's followers were review bombing the business, dropping their rating to a single star within hours. They were calling the firm a front for cybercrime, demanding massive boycotts and organizing a physical protest outside their front doors. The internet mob was actively burning the small design firm's reputation to the ground, based entirely on Felicity's fabricated sob story. Lincoln stood beside my bed, pulling a silver pen from his pocket. "The legal documents are already drafted," he stated, his voice tight with professional disgust at the public character assassination. "The moment you give the word, I will issue an immediate aggressive cease and desist order. We will serve the news station for broadcasting unverified libel, and we will shut down your sister's social media accounts for organized defamation. Do you want me to halt the attack on that design firm?" I looked at the tablet, watching the vicious comments pile up by the second, destroying a business I had absolutely no stake in. I thought about the true owner of that design firm, a notoriously litigious, aggressive corporate holding group that had absolutely zero tolerance for public defamation that impacted their bottom line. Felicity had no idea who she was actually attacking. I handed the tablet back to Lincoln, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "No," I replied softly, settling back against my pillows. "Let them burn that company to the ground." The sterile white walls of the intensive care unit were finally behind me, replaced by the sleek, dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling glass of my downtown penthouse. The city skyline sparkled far below my balcony, a sprawling grid of lights that offered a sharp contrast to the dark, violent scene playing out on the 90-inch monitor mounted to my living room wall. I sat comfortably on my velvet sofa, a bowl of truffle popcorn resting in my lap. I tossed a kernel into my mouth, chewing slowly as I watched the live security feed. On the screen, a battered black SUV pulled up to the curb outside a small, unassuming storefront in the Arts District. The painted sign above the door read, "Aesthetics and Design." 4 men dressed in dark hoodies and heavy boots stepped out of the vehicle. They moved with the hurried, aggressive energy of hired muscle acting on a strict deadline. They carried heavy steel crowbars and cans of neon red spray paint. I watched in absolute silence as the first man swung his crowbar, shattering the massive plate glass front window. The visual was brutal and systematic. The men climbed through the broken glass, tearing into the small reception area. They smashed the computer monitors, ripped the drywall down to the studs, and kicked over the filing cabinets. The 2 men with spray paint went to work on the pristine white walls, tagging the interior with massive dripping letters. "Fraud, thief, homewrecker." They were doing exactly what my mother and sister had paid them to do. Beatrice and Felicity had not been satisfied with their tearful morning news interview. Playing the victims on local television and weaponizing Felicity's pregnancy was only the public phase of their retaliation. Behind closed doors, their humiliated rage required physical destruction. Felicity had rallied her country club network to decimate the firm's online reputation, but Beatrice wanted blood. They had dug into the dark web, traced the outdated public directory associating my name with this specific building, and hired local thugs to physically eradicate what they firmly believed was my only source of income. They wanted me destitute, terrified, and crawling back to their doorstep begging for mercy. Lincoln stood near my marble kitchen island, swirling a glass of neat bourbon. He watched the monitors with a mixture of professional disgust and genuine fascination. He pulled his phone from his tailored suit jacket, his thumb hovering over the screen. "The local precinct is a block away," Lincoln stated, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet penthouse. "I can have a squad car intercept them in exactly 90 seconds. We have their license plate and clear facial recognition from the exterior cameras." I shook my head, grabbing another handful of popcorn. "No. Let them finish their work. I want the interior completely destroyed before they leave." Lincoln frowned, lowering his phone. "Gwendolyn, I understand the desire to gather actionable evidence, but allowing a violent syndicate to demolish your property is an unnecessary risk. Your insurance premiums will skyrocket, and the physical threat to your business infrastructure is entirely avoidable." I turned away from the monitor and looked at Lincoln, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "It is not my business infrastructure, Lincoln. It is a glass house I built specifically for them to throw stones at. I set the popcorn bowl onto the glass coffee table and picked up my encrypted tablet. With a few quick swipes, I bypassed the firewall and pulled up the ownership documentation for aesthetics and design. I handed the tablet to Lincoln. 6 months ago, my private security flagged a series of amateur background checks, probing into my old addresses and financial history. I explained, my voice echoing the cold calculation I had employed to set this trap. I knew immediately it was Beatrice. She could never resist snooping, and she was desperately looking for a pressure point she could exploit to force me back into compliance. So I gave her one. I bought that failing bankrupt design firm through a blind trust. I kept the old signage up. I routed a few meaningless utility bills directly to my personal name. I created the absolute perfect fragile paper trail for her to find. Lincoln stared at the tablet, his brilliant legal mind rapidly processing the corporate hierarchy displayed on the screen. His eyes widened slightly as he traced the complex web of shell companies and holdings, moving past the dummy LLC and following the financial anchor back to its source. "This firm is not an independent entity," Lincoln murmured, looking up from the screen to meet my gaze. "You did not just buy a storefront. I anchored the LLC as a direct physical subsidiary of my primary medtech conglomerate." I confirmed, pointing back toward the television monitor where the thugs were currently smashing the servers in the back room. "Those servers they are destroying with crowbars are not running graphic design software. They are hardwired into the exact same secure network that houses highly classified, federally protected medical data for our government contracts." Lincoln looked back at the live feed. The men were tossing their crowbars into the back of the SUV, entirely unaware of the catastrophic magnitude of their actions. Felicity used a traceable offshore account to wire the payment to these men. I continued, leaning back into the velvet cushions. "My mother authorized the physical strike. They think they just hired a few street thugs to smash the windows of a pathetic little design firm. They have absolutely no idea what they just unleashed. By funding a targeted physical attack on that specific building, Beatrice and Felicity had crossed a line that completely surpassed local vandalism. They had unknowingly orchestrated an act of domestic corporate terrorism against a federally protected infrastructure. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was already dismantling DeAndre's life for wire fraud, but this was an entirely different level of destruction. The federal agents would not just be freezing bank accounts tomorrow morning. They would be kicking down the heavy oak doors of my parents' luxury mansion with heavily armed tactical units. The transition from my luxury penthouse to the absolute apex of the corporate world took less than 48 hours. My medical team had officially cleared me for standard activity, though my clearance was entirely unnecessary. I moved with a cold, singular focus that no amount of physical exhaustion could slow down. I stepped out of my private elevator and onto the top floor of the Obsidian Tower, the gleaming glass-walled nerve center of my medical data analytics firm, Apex Meridian. Walking down the immaculate corridor, the sound of my heels clicking against the polished Italian marble commanded immediate attention. This was my element. I was not the discarded, ungrateful daughter my parents painted me to be. I was the chief executive officer of a multi-hundred-million-dollar conglomerate that controlled the proprietary medical data infrastructure for half the eastern seaboard. I pushed open the heavy glass doors to the primary boardroom. The room was a monument to modern corporate warfare, featuring a massive 30-foot obsidian table surrounded by high-definition tactical screens displaying real-time global market analytics. My executive board was already seated and waiting. 12 of the most ruthless, brilliant financial and legal minds in the industry stood at attention the moment I crossed the threshold. Lincoln sat at my right hand, a thick physical dossier resting in front of him. "Take your seats," I ordered, walking to the head of the table. The panoramic windows behind me framed the city skyline, placing the entire financial district literally beneath my feet. "We are initiating an immediate aggressive pivot in our quarterly acquisition strategy." I tapped the console on the table, instantly bringing up a complex financial web on the primary viewing screen. At the center of the web was a prestigious boutique investment bank named Vanguard Heritage Trust. This institution currently manages just over $2 billion in regional assets, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. They cater primarily to elite old money families in this city. They also happen to be the primary underwriter for Donovan Thorne's commercial real estate ventures and the former employer of a recently disgraced broker named DeAndre. Vanguard Heritage is currently bleeding consumer confidence due to the Federal Bureau of Investigation probe surrounding DeAndre's wire fraud. They are highly leveraged, terrified of bad press, and entirely vulnerable. My chief financial officer, a brilliant cutthroat woman named Sarah, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the incoming data. They are vulnerable, she agreed, her tone purely analytical. But a direct acquisition would trigger antitrust red flags and alert their board. Why are we targeting a boutique firm that holds zero value for our medical technology operations? We are not acquiring them for their portfolio. Sarah, I replied, locking eyes with her. We are acquiring them for their leverage. I want controlling interest in Vanguard Heritage, and I want it done silently. Use our secondary shell corporations. Funnel the capital through the blind trusts we established in Delaware. I want us holding the absolute majority of their voting shares before their executive board even finishes their morning coffee. Lincoln flipped open his dossier, distributing targeted action plans to the rest of the board. The strategy is a hostile phantom takeover, Lincoln explained perfectly, translating my directives into corporate warfare. We exploit the panic caused by the federal raid on the Thorne family. We buy up the distressed shares at a premium through disconnected proxies. Vanguard Heritage will not even realize they have been swallowed whole until the ink on the transfer deeds is completely dry. I looked around the room, meeting the gaze of every single executive. Do not stop buying until we own the debt of every single commercial venture Donovan Thorne has ever touched. I want this executed in 48 hours. The resulting corporate bloodbath was a masterpiece of silent, relentless aggression. My firm did not just enter the market, we flooded it. Over the next 48 hours, Apex Meridian operated like a phantom leviathan. Sarah and her financial team deployed millions in liquid capital, snapping up every available share of Vanguard Heritage through a maze of dummy corporations that were impossible to trace back to me. Whenever a major shareholder showed hesitation, our proxies offered buyout numbers that were simply too lucrative to refuse. Vanguard Heritage was already drowning in the negative press generated by the federal agents kicking down Beatrice and Donovan's doors regarding the vandalism of our subsidiary. The bank's original board members were desperate to offload their shares and escape the incoming federal scrutiny. We happily provided their exit strategy. I barely left the boardroom. I stood by the glass windows watching the digital tickers on the monitors update in real time. The percentage of our ownership climbed steadily, an unstoppable rising tide. 40%, 48%, 51%. By the dawn of the second day, Lincoln walked into the boardroom and placed a single freshly printed document on the obsidian table. The takeover was complete. We had secured 68% of Vanguard Heritage Trust. I officially owned the very institution that funded my father's entire existence. Across the city, entirely ignorant to the massive shift in the tectonic plates of his financial world, Donovan Thorne was barricaded inside his opulent home office. The federal agents had already seized his home computers and frozen his personal accounts regarding the fraud and vandalism charges, but his commercial business was technically a separate entity. He was sweating profusely, screaming at his beleaguered accountant through the phone, desperately trying to shuffle funds from his commercial properties to cover his mounting legal fees. He felt a false sense of security, believing his old money connections at Vanguard Heritage would give him the necessary grace period to weather the storm. He was absolutely convinced he could outsmart the federal government and brush the vandalism charges under the rug. A sharp, heavy knock at his office door interrupted his frantic shouting. He slammed the phone down and yanked the door open. A private courier stood in the hallway, his face entirely devoid of emotion. The courier handed Donovan a thick premium envelope sealed with a red wax stamp. Donovan ripped the envelope open, his thick fingers shaking with exhaustion and rage. He pulled out the crisp, heavy stock paper inside. It was an official notice from Vanguard Heritage Trust, but the letterhead featured a new anonymous corporate crest. He read the first paragraph, and the remaining color rapidly drained from his face. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the heavy oak doorframe to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. The notice was a declaration of immediate default. The new anonymous corporate ownership of Vanguard Heritage had initiated a total margin call. They were instantly calling in every single one of Donovan's commercial business loans, citing a breach of morality clauses due to his active federal investigation. The demand required payment in full within 24 hours. There would be no grace period. There would be no extensions. Donovan was facing absolute instantaneous bankruptcy, and he had absolutely no idea that his own daughter held the executioner's pen. Lincoln stood by the panoramic window of my penthouse, his posture impeccably straight as he monitored the digital readouts on his encrypted tablet. He tapped the screen twice and routed a clean audio feed directly to the surround sound speakers in my living room. We had eyes and ears inside the Thorne family estate, courtesy of the private investigators embedded with the federal agents who had raided their home the day prior. The high-definition audio crackled to life, filling my pristine penthouse with the sounds of absolute desperation. Donovan was screaming. The sheer volume of his rage rattled the microphone. He was slamming his heavy fists against his mahogany desk, cursing every single board member at Vanguard Heritage Trust who had suddenly stopped returning his calls. His commercial empire was completely paralyzed. The margin call had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The automated banking sweeps had seized every dollar in his operating accounts to cover the instant defaults. He could not make payroll. He could not pay his vendors. He could not even buy a cup of coffee without his premium black cards declining with a humiliating beep. Across the room, I could hear Felicity weeping hysterically. The foreclosure notices had been physically taped to the custom iron gates of her luxury mansion that very morning. DeAndre was entirely useless, slumped in a corner of the library, audibly gulping expensive scotch straight from the bottle at 10 in the morning. His career was ash, his reputation was toxic waste, and the federal wire fraud indictment was looming over his head like a guillotine. The mighty Thorne family was in complete disarray, drowning in the exact same terror and helplessness they had casually inflicted upon me for years. Then a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the front door on the audio feed. I leaned forward on my velvet sofa, resting my chin on my hand. "Watch the courier feed," I instructed Lincoln softly. Lincoln mirrored the courier's lapel camera onto the main monitor. A distinguished man in a dark, tailored uniform stood on my parents' front porch, holding a sleek silver tray. Beatrice yanked the door open. Her normally immaculate hair was slightly unkempt, and her eyes were wild with paranoid exhaustion. She immediately launched into a vicious tirade, assuming the man was yet another federal process server coming to deliver more catastrophic legal blows. "Get off my property before I call the police!" Beatrice shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the courier. "We have nothing left to sign. Leave us alone." The courier did not flinch. He bowed slightly and extended the silver tray. "I have a priority delivery for Mr. Donovan Thorne directly from the executive board of Apex Meridian." Beatrice stopped screaming. The heavy gold-embossed envelopes resting on the tray caught the morning sunlight. She snatched them with greedy, trembling hands and slammed the door shut. Lincoln switched the feed back to the interior audio. I listened as Beatrice marched into the library, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floors. "Donovan," she barked, her voice suddenly breathless with a frantic, desperate energy. "Look at this. It is from Apex Meridian, the conglomerate that just bought Vanguard." I heard the sound of heavy cardstock being ripped open. Donovan read the invitation aloud, his voice shaking. It was a formal, highly exclusive invitation to a private corporate gala hosted by the mysterious new chief executive officer of Apex Meridian. The gold text specifically requested the presence of the Thorne family to discuss strategic portfolio restructuring and high-level partnership opportunities moving forward. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and entirely pathetic. The sheer delusion of their narcissism completely overrode their panic. "I told you!" Beatrice gasped, her voice skyrocketing into a pitch of ecstatic triumph. "I told you they were not trying to destroy us, Donovan. The new CEO just wanted to clear out the dead weight. They isolated DeAndre because he is a criminal liability, but they know who we are. They know the Thorn name carries undeniable social capital in this city. This is a bailout. They want to partner with us to rebuild the portfolio. This is our salvation. Donovan eagerly swallowed the poison. He let out a booming, arrogant laugh, the sound of a man who firmly believed the universe existed solely to serve his ego. "You are right, Beatrice," he declared, the fear completely evaporating from his tone. "They just wanted to test our resilience. We just need to show up to this gala and project absolute power. We will negotiate a prime restructuring deal over champagne and caviar. We are going to be completely fine." Felicity immediately chimed in, her tearful panic vanishing as her superficial priorities took control. "I cannot wear anything from my current closet to a billionaire's gala," she whined, her voice dripping with renewed entitlement. "The local press might be there. We have to look flawless to prove we are untouched by this scandal. I need a custom couture gown, but our accounts are frozen," DeAndre mumbled drunkenly from the corner. "How are you going to pay for custom couture when my card just declined for a tank of gas?" Beatrice silenced him with a vicious command. "Shut your mouth, you useless parasite. We are not missing the single opportunity to save our empire just because we are temporarily illiquid." I listened closely as Beatrice marched across the room and opened the heavy steel floor safe hidden behind Donovan's desk. The metallic clanking echoed loudly. "Take the Victorian emerald necklace and the heirloom diamond tiara to the private broker downtown," Beatrice ordered, her voice completely devoid of hesitation. "Pawn them. Pawn all of it if you have to. We will buy the absolute best designer wardrobe money can buy. We must walk into that gala looking like royalty to secure this bailout. Once we sign the new partnership with the CEO, we will just buy the jewels back." I looked up at Lincoln, a dark, immensely satisfied laugh escaping my lips. Lincoln shook his head, a rare smirk breaking his stoic expression. "They are pawning their last remaining generational wealth to buy dresses for a party you are throwing." I picked up my glass of water and took a slow, refreshing sip. "Beatrice always loved a grand entrance," I said softly, staring at the monitor. "I am just making sure she is perfectly dressed for her own execution." The logistical execution of the Apex Meridian Corporate Gala required absolute, ruthless precision. I stood at the head of my obsidian boardroom table, swiping through the digital master guest list on my encrypted tablet. Lincoln stood beside me, cross-referencing the RSVPs with the massive digital seating chart illuminated on the wall monitor. This was not a standard corporate mixer. I was constructing a perfectly sealed high society cage. "Move the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to table 4. I instructed, tapping a name on the glass screen. "I want him seated directly across from the local district attorney." Lincoln nodded, his fingers flying across his own device to update the master schematic. "And the Vanguard Heritage Trust clients. Seat them at tables 5 through 8. I replied, my voice cool and even. "Put DeAndre's former primary investors right at the edge of the center aisle. I want the people he personally defrauded to have a front row seat to his absolute destruction." The trap was set. The bait had been eagerly swallowed. Now it was simply a matter of aesthetics. Later that afternoon, the stark contrast between my reality and my family's desperate delusion played out across the city. Inside the master suite of my penthouse, a renowned Italian tailor meticulously pinned the hem of my custom couture gown. The dress was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk and woven silver thread structured with sharp architectural lines that projected pure, unyielding authority. As I stood on the fitting pedestal, I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I did not look like the discarded, scapegoated daughter anymore. I looked like an executioner. Miles away, deep in this gritty heart of the Diamond District, Felicity was experiencing a very different kind of fitting. Through the private investigator Lincoln had assigned to tail them, I received a live audio feed of my sister's frantic negotiations inside a high-security pawn shop. The environment was a far cry from the luxury boutiques she was accustomed to. Thick, bulletproof glass separated her from a notoriously ruthless pawnbroker. This is a late 19th century heirloom diamond tiara. Felicity shrieked, her voice echoing off the dingy walls of the shop. My mother wore this on her wedding day. The center stone alone is flawless. It is worth at least $60,000. I demand you give me $50,000 in cash right now. The pawnbroker let out a dry, rasping cough. I will give you $15,000. Take it or leave it. Felicity gasped, the sound of her manicured hand slapping the reinforced glass coming through the audio feed. 15,000. That barely covers the deposit on the Valentino gown I put on hold. Do you know who I am? My father is Donovan Thorne. The pawnbroker was entirely unimpressed. Donovan Thorne just defaulted on $2 billion worth of commercial real estate loans, sweetheart. It is on the front page of the Financial Times. 15,000. Final offer. There was a long, agonizing pause filled only with the sound of Felicity's rapid, panicked breathing. She was a woman completely addicted to an illusion, entirely willing to liquidate her family's last shred of generational wealth just to maintain the appearance of status for a single night. Fine, Felicity spat venomously. Give me the cash. I smiled, letting the audio feed disconnect. They were cannibalizing themselves, financing their own public ruin just for the chance to beg an anonymous CEO for a bailout. The evening of the gala arrived with a crackle of electric anticipation. The venue was the grand ballroom of the city's premier art museum, a cavernous space of marble columns and vaulted ceilings. I remained in the private VIP suite overlooking the main floor, waiting for the precise moment to make my descent. A quiet knock sounded at the suite door before it swung open. Dr. Mitchell Reed stepped inside. He looked incredibly sharp in a tailored black tuxedo, a stark departure from the sterile white coat he wore the night he saved my life. I had personally invited him as my exclusive guest, a silent gesture of gratitude to the one person who had stood between me and my parents' psychiatric hold. Mitchell walked over to the glass balcony overlooking the ballroom. He observed the federal agents mingling near the bar, the district attorney chatting with the bank investors, and the heavy, undeniable presence of my corporate security team securing every exit. He turned back to face me, his intelligent eyes scanning my midnight blue gown and the cold, focused expression on my face. You are not just revealing your identity tonight, are you, Gwendolyn? Mitchell asked, softly, stepping closer. He looked back down at the ballroom floor, piecing the tactical layout together with clinical precision. You invited the FBI. You invited the local prosecutors. You invited the people your brother-in-law robbed. This is not a corporate coming-out party. This is a highly coordinated ambush. I stepped up to the glass beside him, looking down at the empty center table reserved strictly for the Thorne family. I am simply providing a venue for the truth to reveal itself, Mitchell. I replied, my voice perfectly steady. My family believes they are walking into a negotiation. They believe they can charm the new CEO of Apex Meridian into forgiving their massive debts and burying their federal crimes. I am just going to let them make their pitch. Mitchell let out a low whistle, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. Remind me never to cross you. A sudden flurry of camera flashes near the main entrance caught my attention. The valet line at the front of the museum had just received its most anticipated arrival. A massive, ostentatious stretch limousine pulled up to the red carpet. It was clearly a cheap rental, the kind used for high school proms rather than corporate summits, but my family treated it like a royal carriage. The driver opened the door and Donovan stepped out first, adjusting the lapels of a tuxedo that looked slightly too tight around his waist. Beatrice followed, dripping in whatever secondary jewels she had not yet pawned, her chin held unnaturally high as she surveyed the crowd with absolute disdain. Felicity emerged last, clinging to DeAndre's arm. She was wearing the staggeringly expensive bright crimson Valentino gown she had sacrificed her mother's tiara to buy. DeAndre looked physically ill, his skin pale and slick with sweat, but Felicity forced him to stand straight, practically dragging him toward the entrance. They marched up the museum steps together, radiating a toxic, completely unearned arrogance. They believed they were the elite. They believed they were walking in to reclaim their stolen throne and charm the anonymous corporate giant who held their fate. They had absolutely no idea. They were stepping directly into the center of a federal cage, and I was holding the only key. The heavy brass doors of the museum's grand ballroom swung inward, and the Thorne family finally crossed the threshold. I watched from the shadows of the VVIP glass balcony, a crystal glass of sparkling water in my hand, observing their arrival with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching microbes enter a maze. They moved as a single, aggressively entitled unit, radiating a toxic, completely unearned arrogance. Donovan led the charge, his chest puffed out beneath a tuxedo that strained against his midsection. He threw familiar, booming laughs at people who immediately averted their eyes, entirely misinterpreting their avoidance as respect. Beatrice glided beside him, her gaze sweeping over the marble columns, the towering floral arrangements, and the glittering elite of the city, with the scrutinizing glare of an offended monarch. She possessed the audacity of a woman who believed she owned the building simply by standing inside it. Within 30 seconds of her arrival, Beatrice flagged down the nearest passing waiter. She plucked a crystal flute from his silver tray, took one tiny performative sip, and physically shoved the glass back into the waiter's chest. "Are you serving standard Prosecco at an executive summit?" Beatrice hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, intentionally loud enough to turn heads at the adjacent tables. "Take this back to the bar immediately and find me a vintage reserve. Do not return to my presence until you have secured a label that does not taste like commercial battery acid." The waiter nodded stiffly and hurried away, his face flushed with embarrassment. Felicity, meanwhile, smoothed the heavy crimson silk of her Valentino gown, basking in the glow of the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. She posed, shifting her weight to ensure the event photographers near the entrance caught the dramatic thigh-high slit of her skirt. She was entirely oblivious to the dark irony that she was wrapped in the last dying breath of her family's generational wealth. DeAndre, sweating profusely through the collar of his suit, immediately broke off from the family unit. He desperately needed validation, a quick synthetic hit of the social status he had incinerated. He zeroed in on a group of his former high society investors standing near the towering center ice sculpture. These were the exact men and women he had personally defrauded, the individuals who had filed the federal complaints that triggered his ruin. Arthur Richard. DeAndre greeted them, his voice artificially deep and booming, as he clapped a terrified-looking older man on the shoulder. "Incredible venue for a summit, isn't it?" Arthur stared at DeAndre, his face a mask of pure revulsion. DeAndre Arthur stated, his tone freezing the air between them. "I am genuinely shocked to see you showing your face in public tonight, considering the news regarding your accounts." DeAndre let out a sharp, forced bark of a laugh, adjusting his cuffs with trembling fingers. "Oh, you know exactly how the financial media exaggerates a minor audit. I actually left the firm voluntarily. I am launching an independent venture. We are focusing on disruptive technology in the medical sector. That is exactly why the new chief executive officer invited us tonight. We are here to formalize a private, highly lucrative partnership." Nearby, Donovan was cornering a tall, stoic man near the carving station. Donovan was completely unaware that the man he was currently lecturing was the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "You have to understand the current market volatility," Donovan bellowed, swirling a fresh glass of bourbon and jabbing his finger in the air for emphasis. Vanguard Heritage was playing it entirely too safe. This new Apex Meridian conglomerate has actual vision. They bought up my debt specifically because we are finalizing a massive multi-tiered commercial merger. They want the Thorne family anchoring their regional portfolio. We are the absolute bedrock of this city. The federal director took a slow, measured sip of his water. His eyes tracked Donovan with the cold, detached fascination of a predator watching a severely injured animal boast about its speed. "That sounds incredibly ambitious, Mr. Thorne," the director replied softly. "I look forward to seeing exactly how your portfolio restructuring plays out." A low, persistent hum of nervous whispers rippled through the ballroom, completely drowning out the classical string quartet playing in the corner. The elite crowd was not discussing the modern art on the walls or the quality of the catered caviar. They were obsessing over the phantom entity at the absolute top of the corporate food chain. "I heard he liquidated a massive European hedge fund last week, just for a quarterly tax. Right off a woman in emerald silk murmured to her companion, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I was told it is a consortium of tech billionaires, another man argued, adjusting his silk tie. No single person buys 51% of Vanguard overnight without a small army of corporate lawyers and infinite capital. Whoever they are absolutely ruthless. They called in a dozen elite margin accounts this morning without a second of hesitation. Half the people in this room are terrified they are next on the chopping block. Felicity ignored the terrified whispers too, consumed with admiring her own reflection in the mirrored pillars lining the dance floor. She grabbed a fresh champagne flute from a passing tray and turned toward the center of the room, preparing to join DeAndre and project the flawless image of a wealthy power couple. She threw her head back, letting out a bright, piercing artificial laugh meant to draw the attention and envy of the entire room. As she laughed, her gaze drifted upward, sweeping past the massive crystal chandelier and landing on the VIP glass balcony, suspended directly above the ballroom floor. Her laugh died instantly. The blood drained from her face with a terrifying speed, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly white against the vibrant crimson of her couture gown. Her fingers went entirely numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp, plummeting downward and shattering violently against the polished marble floor. The sharp, explosive crash echoed through the cavernous space, immediately silencing the conversations around her. "What the hell is she doing here?" Felicity choked out, her voice trembling with a sudden absolute terror as she stared directly into my eyes. Beatrice followed the trajectory of her daughter's terrified gaze, her eyes snapping upward to the glass balcony. Even from 30 feet below, I could see the exact moment her confusion curdled into a furious, panicked rage. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the pawnshop-funded jewelry glittering under the chandeliers. She said something sharp to Donovan, gesturing frantically upward before grabbing Felicity by the wrist. Leaving the men to awkwardly attempt to blend in with the financial elite they had just defrauded. My mother and sister began marching toward the private roped-off staircase leading to my lounge. I watched them navigate the crowded ballroom floor with the desperate, aggressive energy of cornered animals. They shoved past bank executives and federal agents alike, entirely uncaring of the scene they were making. Mitchell leaned against the glass railing beside me, tracking their rapid ascent. "I believe your guests are coming up to pay their respects," he noted, his voice carrying a dry, clinical amusement. They reached the velvet rope at the base of the VVIP stairs. A heavily built private security contractor in a dark suit immediately stepped into their path, raising a massive hand to block their entry. I could not hear the exchange, but the body language was unmistakable. Beatrice was puffing her chest out, pointing aggressively at the stairs, screaming demands based entirely on the fading power of her last name. The guard remained completely rigid, shaking his head. Then Beatrice reached into her designer clutch. She pulled out a thick wad of cash, the leftover bills from pawning her mother's tiara, and shoved it directly into the guard's chest. The guard glanced up at the balcony, meeting my eyes. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I wanted them up here. The guard smoothly pocketed the cash, unhooked the velvet rope, and stepped aside. Less than a minute later, the heavy oak doors to the private lounge burst open. Beatrice and Felicity stormed into the room, their chests heaving from the rapid climb. The stark contrast between us was immediately apparent. I stood perfectly still in my custom midnight blue silk, projecting absolute effortless authority. Beatrice looked frantic, her posture rigid with a brittle defensive tension. Felicity looked entirely out of place in her loud crimson gown, her eyes darting nervously around the plush leather and mahogany interior of the exclusive lounge. "What in the name of God are you doing here?" Beatrice hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic, venomous panic as she marched toward me. "Did you bribe someone at the catering company to let you in the back door? Did you sneak in here to hunt for a sugar daddy to pay off your pathetic little storefront?" I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, my expression completely entirely blank. "I am simply enjoying the view, Beatrice," I replied, my voice calm and completely unbothered. "You are going to ruin everything," Beatrice snarled, stepping so close I could smell the sharp metallic tang of her nervous sweat masked by expensive perfume. We are currently downstairs securing a massive financial partnership with the new CEO of this conglomerate. We are finalizing a bailout that will completely restore this family's empire. If the Apex Meridian executives see you up here looking like some cheap, desperate party crasher, it will humiliate us. You are going to ruin our deal with the CEO. Get out before I have you thrown out myself. Felicity stepped up beside her mother, her face twisted into an ugly, triumphant sneer. She crossed her arms, desperate to inflict whatever emotional damage she could to secure her own fragile sense of superiority. We cut you off 5 years ago because you were nothing but a pathetic college dropout. Felicity spat, her voice dripping with pure disdain. You could not handle the pressure of an elite university, so you quit, and Dad threw you out on the street where you belonged. You have spent the last 5 years selling graphic designs for pennies. You do not belong in a room with people who actually matter. Did you really think renting a dress and crashing a billionaire's party would magically make you one of us again? You are a failure, Gwendolyn. Leave before security drags you out by your hair. Mitchell let out a quiet, dark chuckle from the shadows near the bar. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the two women dig their own graves with professional fascination. Beatrice whipped her head toward him, her eyes narrowing as she took in his tailored tuxedo. "And who exactly are you?" she demanded, attempting to assert a dominance she absolutely did not possess. Another bottom-feeding loser she dragged in off the street to play dress-up. "I assure you, Beatrice," I stated, stepping smoothly between them and placing my glass on the polished marble counter. "I do not need to crash this party, and I certainly do not need to hunt for a sugar daddy. I am exactly where I am supposed to be." "You are delusional!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the lounge. She reached into her clutch, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. "I am calling the building security right now. You are jeopardizing the Thorne legacy, and I will not allow your pathetic, desperate jealousy to destroy our salvation." Before her thumb could hit the screen, the atmosphere in the entire building shifted. The soft, ambient classical music drifting up from the ballroom below abruptly cut off. The sudden, heavy silence was absolute. Beatrice froze, her phone hovering in the air. Then the massive crystal chandeliers illuminating the grand ballroom instantly dimmed, plunging the entire lower floor into a dramatic, expectant darkness. A single, blinding white spotlight cut through the shadows, hitting the center of the main presentation stage at the far end of the room. The voice of my lead event organizer boomed over the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers, the deep resonant audio vibrating through the floorboards of the VVIP lounge. "Ladies and gentlemen," the organizer announced, the sheer magnitude of the moment forcing the entire elite crowd into a hushed, terrified silence. "Thank you for joining us on this historic evening. It is my absolute honor to introduce the visionary mind behind the acquisition of Vanguard Heritage Trust. Please direct your attention to the main stage and welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Meridian." Beatrice and Felicity immediately rushed to the glass balcony, pressing their hands against the railing, their eyes wide with greedy, desperate anticipation. They were staring down at the empty stage, practically salivating, completely ready to bow down and worship whatever corporate giant walked into the spotlight to save them. Beatrice pressed her hands against the glass barrier, her breath fogging the pristine surface as she leaned over the edge. Her eyes were wide, frantic with a greed so deep it looked like actual hunger. Beside her, Felicity gripped the railing, her knuckles turning white. They were waiting for their savior. They were waiting for the anonymous billionaire who was going to erase their debts, overlook their federal crimes, and hand them back the keys to the city. "Look closely, Gwendolyn," Beatrice sneered, her eyes remaining glued to the empty stage below. "That is what real power looks like. A self-made titan who actually controls the world. Take notes before the guards come up here to drag you back to the gutter." I stepped up right beside her, feeling the low electric hum of the event speakers vibrating through the floorboards. I looked down at the expectant crowd of 500 elites, then back at my mother's profile. She had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a foolish, naive girl for prioritizing structural engineering and mathematics over marrying into old money. She had laughed when my father severed my tuition, telling me I would come crawling back the second I realized I could not survive without their allowance. I lifted my hand and pressed the cold condensation-slicked crystal of my water glass firmly against Beatrice's palm. Her fingers reflexively curled around the glass. She tore her eyes away from the empty stage, turning toward me with a look of absolute furious bewilderment. "Hold this," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the tension of the lounge. "I have a speech to give." Before she could process the words, the heavy mahogany doors separating the VVIP lounge from the grand sweeping staircase swung outward. The movement was perfectly timed by my security detail. I stepped out onto the open mezzanine landing, leaving my mother and sister frozen behind the glass. Instantly, the blinding white spotlight shot upward. It abandoned the empty stage below and snapped directly onto me, catching the woven silver threads of my midnight blue gown and illuminating me like a beacon against the dark museum architecture. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed up from the ballroom floor. 500 faces tilted upward. "Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Meridian." The organizer's voice boomed over the speakers, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "Gwendolyn Thorne." Inside the glass lounge, the crystal water glass slipped from Beatrice's hand. It shattered against the floor, but the sound was entirely drowned out by the thunderous applause erupting from my corporate executives scattered throughout the crowd. Beatrice's face went completely slack. The brittle, arrogant mask she had worn for decades shattered just as easily as the glass. Her knees literally buckled beneath her. She collapsed hard against the railing, her legs giving out entirely as her mind violently rejected the reality playing out in front of her. Felicity let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She clutched her own throat, her eyes bulging as she watched the sister she had just called a pathetic college dropout begin a slow, regal descent down the marble staircase. I did not look back at them. I kept my chin perfectly level, my posture completely straight, descending the steps with the measured, predatory grace of an executioner ascending a scaffold. Down on the ballroom floor, the devastation rippled outward with brutal precision. Donovan stood near the carving station, mid-laugh, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of top-shelf bourbon. He heard my name echo through the room. He turned his face flushed with alcohol and unearned arrogance and looked up at the spotlight. The moment his eyes locked onto me, his jaw went completely slack. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped straight through his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, splashing amber liquid and shattered glass across his polished leather shoes. He did not even flinch. He stood paralyzed, his chest heaving, his mind short-circuiting, as he realized the anonymous predator who had bought up his $2 billion in defaulted loans was the daughter he had thrown away. Near the center ice sculpture, DeAndre was experiencing his own personal nightmare. He was standing shoulder to shoulder with the very investors he had defrauded, men who had just been clapping him on the back. When the spotlight hit me, DeAndre's skin turned the color of wet ash. He stared up at me in sheer, unadulterated horror. He knew exactly what this meant. The new CEO of Apex Meridian was the only person who possessed the unredacted digital ledgers, proving he had embezzled millions. He realized instantly that I had not invited the FBI regional director and the local district attorney to this gala for networking. I had invited them here to watch him hang. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the main presentation stage. The applause slowly died down, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The entire room was holding its breath. The federal agents near the bar stood a little straighter. The defrauded investors glared at DeAndre, suddenly understanding the trap. And the Thorne family, scattered and broken, stared at me with the terrified realization that they had walked willingly into a slaughterhouse. I walked to the center of the stage and pulled the sleek microphone from its stand. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, my gaze sweeping over the crowd before locking directly onto my father's pale, sweating face, then shifting to DeAndre's trembling hands, and finally looking up at the glass balcony where my mother was still slumped against the railing. "Good evening," I said, my voice echoing with crisp, unwavering authority through the massive ballroom. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the future of Apex Meridian. However, before we discuss our corporate acquisitions, I would like to extend a very special welcome to my family. I paused, letting a cold, razor-sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. In fact, I brought a presentation just for them. I did not launch into a standard corporate monologue about synergy market acquisitions or quarterly growth. Instead, I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers. The sharp percussive sound echoed through the microphone like a gunshot. Behind me, the three massive digital monitors stretching across the back of the stage instantly dropped their sleek Apex Meridian logos. They plunged into pitch black. A single line of stark white text appeared on the center screen. It displayed a date from exactly 1 year ago, followed by a precise location. Boston General Hospital Intensive Care Unit Corridor, Camera 4. The ballroom speakers hissed to life with the unmistakable crackle of intercepted security audio. Then my mother's voice filled the cavernous room. It was not her polished high society tone, the one she used to terrorize waiters and command charity boards. It was the cold, calculating whisper she reserved for behind closed doors when she was tearing my life apart. "We cannot wait for the doctors to make a decision." DeAndre Beatrice's recorded voice echoed her words, sharp, urgent, and dripping with venom. "You know exactly what she found in the firm's ledgers before the accident. Pull the plug. If she wakes up, we go to jail." A collective gasp ripped through the audience. 500 of the city's most powerful elites physically recoiled. The sound of shattered illusions filled the room. The audio continued amplifying DeAndre's panicked, sweaty response. "The nurses are doing rounds. We cannot just walk in there and shut off her life support, Beatrice. It is murder. They will check the machines. It is survival." Beatrice's recorded voice snapped back with terrifying zero hesitation. "She is a scapegoat. She has always been the scapegoat. If we let her live, Donovan loses the company and you face 30 years in federal prison for embezzling the Vanguard accounts. Do it tonight while the night staff is changing shifts." The audio abruptly cut off, plunging the ballroom back into a suffocating, heavy silence. The reaction on the floor was instantaneous and brutal. This was no longer a corporate summit. It was an active crime scene broadcast live to the people whose opinions my family valued more than oxygen. Near the towering ice sculpture, the group of wealthy investors who had just been shaking DeAndre's hand backed away from him, as if he were carrying a highly contagious plague. The physical space around him expanded rapidly as people scrambled to distance themselves from a man casually discussing murder. Arthur, the primary investor. DeAndre had actively been trying to charm moments earlier, lifted his pristine linen napkin and literally wiped the hand that had just touched DeAndre's shoulder. "You absolutely disgust me," Arthur stated, his voice ringing out in the dead quiet of the ballroom, laced with pure revulsion. "You are not a businessman. You are an absolute monster." DeAndre stumbled backward, his knees practically buckling under the weight of his public ruin. He looked wildly around the room, searching for a friendly face, searching for an exit, but found only a wall of furious, disgusted glares. The regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who had been standing stoically while Donovan boasted just minutes prior, subtly raised 2 fingers. Half a dozen plainclothes agents instantly moved out of the shadows, quietly securing every exit in the ballroom. The trap had officially sprung shut. Up in the VIP lounge, the illusion of Beatrice Thorne's absolute authority disintegrated into dust. Through the glass, I watched my mother press her hands over her ears, her face contorted in a silent scream of absolute terror. She was entirely trapped in a cage of her own making. There were no waiters to yell at, no managers to bribe, no social standing left to protect her. Felicity stood beside her, paralyzed, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The crimson Valentino gown she wore suddenly looked like a ridiculous costume. The reality of her husband's and mother's actions finally penetrated her thick skull. Her perfect manicured life was entirely financed by my attempted murder. I gripped the microphone, letting the reality of their public execution sink into the marrow of their bones. For years they had spun a masterful narrative that I was the unstable, disappointing daughter who could not handle the pressure of the family legacy. They had used my sudden hospitalization as an opportunity to clean their financial slate, entirely prepared to let me die, just to bury their own federal crimes. They believed their wealth made them untouchable. They believed they could sanitize attempted murder with expensive lawyers and perfectly curated press releases. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet, lethal calm of my tone commanded absolute obedience from every person in the room. For decades, the Thorne family has operated under the assumption that loyalty is a one-way street. I stated, my eyes locked directly onto my father. Donovan was now trembling uncontrollably near the catering station, the color completely drained from his face. They demanded total obedience while actively cannibalizing anyone who threatened their absolute control. When I discovered the truth about their operations, they did not just fire me, they attempted to silence me permanently. Donovan opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, blustering defense to the crowd, but no sound came out. He was a man watching his entire universe collapse in real time. The high society crowd he had desperately sought validation from was now looking at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The legacy he had built on a foundation of lies and exploitation was burning to ash on a brightly lit stage. I smiled, the expression completely devoid of warmth. I had delivered the first killing blow, severing their social standing and exposing their moral bankruptcy, but I was nowhere near finished tearing their empire apart. "But wait," I said softly, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the ballroom with surgical precision. "There is more. Let us look at the financial portfolio." I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers a second time. The massive digital screens behind me instantly shifted. The horrifying hospital surveillance feed vanished, replaced immediately by a staggering, undeniable wall of financial evidence. The resolution was flawless, exposing every dirty secret the Thorne family thought they had buried forever. On the center monitor, I displayed the fraudulent loan applications. They bore my forged signature alongside the fabricated Social Security documents they had used to secure their initial Vanguard capital. Beside those documents, I projected the secure IP address logs, directly tracing the digital forgery back to the private router located inside Donovan Thorne's personal home office. On the left screen, a complex web of wire transfers lit up the darkness. I had mapped their money trail with brutal, undeniable clarity. Bright red arrows tracked millions of dollars bleeding out of the Vanguard employee pension funds. The screen showed the stolen money washing through 3 separate offshore shell accounts before landing directly in the escrow account for Felicity's brand new $20 million beachfront mansion. I looked up at the VVIP lounge. Felicity was staring blankly at the left screen, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the fabric of her expensive crimson gown. Her entire social standing, her pristine upper-class image, her sprawling luxury estate, it was all bought with stolen pensions. She was nothing but a fraud, and now 500 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the city knew exactly what she was. She looked down at the crowd, meeting the judging, disgusted eyes of the women she had spent years trying to impress. On the right screen, I played the high-definition security footage from my independent design studio. The video clearly showed the masked men shattering my storefront glass, destroying my expensive servers, and maliciously vandalizing my work. I did not stop there. I seamlessly superimposed the payroll receipts from a dummy LLC directly over the vandalism video. The corporate registry documents clearly listed DeAndre as the sole beneficiary and operator of that shadow company. The timeline proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had authorized the cash payments to those thugs exactly 12 hours before they tore my business apart. I stepped forward, pacing the edge of the polished stage with predatory grace. I did not need to shout. The pristine acoustics of the ballroom carried my cold, measured voice to every corner of the room. "Notice the exact dates on these wire transfers, ladies and gentlemen," I instructed, gesturing sharply to the glowing screens. "They align perfectly with the sudden, inexplicable deficits in the Vanguard pension accounts. My family needed a convenient scapegoat to take the fall for their monumental greed. When I walked away from their toxic empire and built my own legitimate success, they panicked. They hired criminals to destroy my business, hoping to force me back into their financial chokehold so they could continue using my identity for their shadow loans." The ballroom erupted. These elite executives and ruthless investors were no strangers to cutthroat business tactics, but they absolutely despised sloppy, pathetic thievery. The low murmur of disgust rapidly swelled into a deafening roar of outrage. The people who had just been drinking Donovan's champagne and eating his caviar were now glaring at him like he was a disease. From the center of the angry crowd, a booming, furious voice echoed over the din. It was Marcus Vance, the senior managing partner of the elite firm DeAndre had desperately been trying to impress all evening. Marcus violently shoved his way to the front of the crowd, his face purple with rage. "You are entirely finished," DeAndre Marcus roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at the cowering man. "You actually think you can steal from our peers and stand in our presence? I will personally see to it that you never work in finance again. You are blacklisted from every firm, every bank, and every boardroom on this continent. You are absolutely radioactive." DeAndre crumpled. The arrogant, swaggering executive vanished, replaced instantly by a broken, pathetic shell. He dropped heavily to his knees right there on the polished marble floor, burying his face in his trembling hands, entirely destroyed by his own hubris. Donovan Thorne realized the walls were rapidly closing in. His survival instinct, honed by decades of corporate backstabbing, finally overpowered his shock. He spun around, completely abandoning his dignity, his disgraced son-in-law, and his terrified family. He shoved violently past a startled bank executive and sprinted frantically toward the grand mahogany exit doors at the rear of the ballroom. He hit the heavy wood with his shoulder, grabbing the ornate brass handles and pulling with all his desperate might. The doors did not move an inch. From the darkened alcoves flanking the exit, my private security contractors stepped forward. They were massive, silent men in tailored suits. They crossed their arms, entirely blocking his path. Donovan rattled the handles again, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. One of the guards simply shook his head, a gesture of absolute finality. Donovan Thorne, the man who had ruled his empire with an iron fist, slid slowly down the face of the locked doors, burying his head between his knees in total defeat. High above the chaos, the ambient microphones in the VVIP lounge picked up a new sound. It was raw, guttural, and entirely pathetic. Beatrice was weeping. The fierce, demanding shrieks she was famous for had completely evaporated. The horrifying realization had finally crushed the very last of her grand delusions. The daughter she had discarded, mocked, and tried to murder had methodically and publicly orchestrated her absolute ruin. I looked up at the glass balcony. Beatrice pressed her tear-streaked face against the barrier, her expensive makeup running down her pale cheeks in dark, ugly rivers. Her lips moved silently, mouthing the word, "please," over and over again. I held her gaze, my expression completely blank, offering her absolutely nothing in return. She had shown me no mercy, and I was finally returning the favor. The angry shouts and murmurs of the trapped crowd suddenly began to fade. A new piercing sound bled through the thick walls of the museum. The faint, rhythmic wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder and significantly more urgent by the second. The heavy velvet curtains framing the massive floor-to-ceiling windows facing the avenue suddenly pulsed with harsh, vivid color. Bright, rhythmic flashes of red and blue police lights sliced through the darkness of the ballroom, washing over the terrified, pale faces of the Thorne family. The rhythmic flashing of the police cruisers outside painted the ballroom in alternating shades of crimson and sapphire. The heavy brass handles of the main entrance turned. The towering oak doors were shoved open with such violent force they slammed against the marble walls, the sound cracking through the room like a whip. Dozens of uniformed police officers and tactical federal agents flooded into the venue. The sheer physical presence of the law completely shattered whatever lingering illusion of a high society gala remained. The orchestra pit was dead silent. The 500 elite guests immediately flattened themselves against the walls and catering tables, parting like the Red Sea, to create a wide, clear path for the authorities. The squeak of tactical boots on polished stone and the sharp crackle of police radios were the only sounds echoing through the cavernous space. The lead FBI agent, a tall woman with an icy professional demeanor that matched my own, did not even glance at the terrified billionaires lining the room. She marched directly toward the center of the floor, where DeAndre was still kneeling in the puddle of Donovan's spilled bourbon. Two heavily built agents flanked her, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. DeAndre slowly raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and wide with animal panic. He opened his mouth perhaps to demand his lawyer or assert his corporate status, but the agents did not give him the chance to speak. They did not treat him like a white-collar executive caught adjusting a spreadsheet. They treated him like a violent criminal actively plotting a murder. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his custom-tailored tuxedo and hauled him roughly to his feet. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping dangerously on the wet marble. "Turn around and interlock your fingers behind your back," the lead agent ordered, her voice carrying an absolute, uncompromising authority. DeAndre hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brain refusing to process his sudden loss of power. The agents instantly swept his arms backward with practiced aggressive force. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the quiet room. DeAndre let out a pathetic, strangled whimper as the cold metal bit into his wrists, pressing painfully against the face of his luxury watch. "You are under arrest," the agent stated, staring directly into his terrified eyes as she pulled him upright. "You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." While DeAndre was being read his rights and Frog marched toward the exit, the chaos continued to unfold across the room. At the rear doors, Donovan was aggressively patted down and detained against the glass by two local officers. His cheek was pressed flat against the very barrier he had desperately tried to escape, through his hands secured tightly behind his back. Up on the mezzanine, Beatrice was being escorted out of the VVIP lounge by a stern female officer. My mother was completely hyperventilating, her pawnshop jewelry rattling against her chest as she sobbed uncontrollably. The formidable, terrifying matriarch of the Thorn Empire was completely gone, replaced by a broken, humiliated woman who finally understood she had absolutely nowhere left to hide. Then a blur of crimson tore through the paralyzed crowd. Felicity, who had remained frozen on the balcony during the initial breach, had sprinted down the side staircase. She shoved past a group of stunned bank executives, nearly tripping over the heavy hem of her expensive Valentino gown. Her perfectly styled hair was a ruined, tangled mess. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked completely deranged, a woman watching her entire universe, her status, her wealth, her fraudulent marriage evaporate into thin air. She reached the edge of the presentation stage and threw herself forward. She slammed onto her knees right at my feet, her hands reaching out to grab frantic fistfuls of my midnight blue silk dress. She anchored herself to me, weeping with a loud, hysterical desperation that made the remaining guests cringe in secondhand embarrassment. The elite society she had spent her entire life trying to impress was now looking down at her with absolute disgust. "Gwen, please," Felicity shrieked, her voice cracking as she stared up at me with wild, pleading eyes. "I'm your sister. I have nothing. They're taking my house, my husband. Help me." She yanked on the fabric of my skirt, her tears splashing onto the polished stage. She was begging the very person she had spent 3 decades torturing. She expected my familiar, conditioned compliance. She expected the quiet, obedient girl, who always took the blame, to suddenly step in and shield her from the consequences of her own horrific greed. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman clawing at my hem. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering familial obligation. I looked at her ruined, desperate face and remembered every single moment of calculated cruelty she had inflicted upon me. I remembered her mocking my ambitions, spending my stolen future, and standing by while her husband actively planned to stop my heart from beating. I reached down, my hands moving with slow, deliberate precision. I gripped her wrists. Her skin was clammy and slick with nervous sweat. I pried her fingers off my dress, peeling them back one by one with unyielding strength, and firmly pushed her hands away. I stepped back, smoothing the silk of my skirt, rendering myself entirely untouchable. I looked straight into her panicked, streaming eyes, watching the very last shred of her hope completely extinguish. You shredded my thesis, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that only she could hear. I shredded your life. We're even. Felicity collapsed entirely, her forehead pressing against the cold marble floor as she sobbed into her manicured hands. I did not step back. I simply stepped over her. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the ballroom swung open again, admitting a second massive wave of law enforcement. This squad consisted of local police and specialized state detectives, their silver badges glinting sharply in the strobing red and blue emergency lights bleeding through the tall windows. They marched with heavy synchronized steps directly toward the back wall where my private security contractors were holding Donovan Thorne captive. Donovan tried frantically to straighten his ruined suit jacket, desperately attempting to summon the arrogant, untouchable patriarch persona that had terrorized me and the financial sector for decades. It failed miserably. Two heavily built officers grabbed him by the shoulders, spun him around roughly, and slammed him chest first against the mahogany panels. Donovan Thorne, the lead detective, announced, his voice booming off the vaulted museum ceiling. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, massive money laundering, and accessory to attempted manslaughter. Donovan thrashed wildly against the officers, his face turning an ugly mottled shade of purple. He demanded his high-priced lawyers. He shouted that he personally knew the mayor and the police commissioner. The officers completely ignored his pathetic blustering. They yanked his arms backward and snapped the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists with a sharp, echoing click. The mighty titan of industry was instantly reduced to a sweating, red-faced criminal pinned against a wall while his peers watched in horrified fascination. Up in the glass-walled VIP lounge, the situation was unfolding with even more violence. Two female detectives stepped forcefully through the VIP entrance, completely boxing Beatrice in. My mother shrank back against the tufted velvet sofa, her hands raised defensively, her face pale with raw terror. The detectives did not hesitate or show an ounce of deference to her social status. They grabbed her by the arms, hauling her aggressively to her feet with zero regard for her tearing designer gown. Beatrice Thorne, one detective stated coldly, reading from a small notepad. You are under arrest for criminal conspiracy, severe medical endangerment, and attempted manslaughter. The words attempted manslaughter rang through the acoustic perfection of the ballroom like a gunshot. The remaining high society guests gasped collectively, stepping even further back toward the walls. These were cutthroat people who tolerated Donovan's ruthless boardroom tactics, but attempted murder crossed a line even the most morally bankrupt billionaires would not touch. The disgusted whispers rippled through the crowd, branding my parents as absolute monsters. The detectives marched Beatrice down the grand, sweeping staircase. She stumbled on the polished marble steps, her expensive heels clattering loudly, her knees buckling under the weight of her imminent ruin. For the first time in my entire life, she looked small. The terrifying woman who had dictated my every move, who had deliberately triggered my allergies to poison me and locked me in a dark basement to protect her lies, was now shaking uncontrollably in police custody. They brought her to the center of the ballroom floor, forcing her to stand right next to her handcuffed husband and her weeping, destroyed favorite daughter. DeAndre was already being dragged out the front doors by the federal agents, his shoes dragging uselessly along the floor. The Thorne family, once the untouchable, shimmering royalty of the city, was now a pathetic, trembling lineup of detained felons. Beatrice looked up and locked eyes with me. Her meticulously applied makeup was totally destroyed, running down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged tracks of mascara. The horrifying reality of federal prison was finally breaking through her lifelong delusions of grandeur. She looked at my posture, my calm demeanor, and the absolute control I commanded over the room. She realized I was the only person left on Earth with the money, the power, and the influence to potentially mitigate this absolute disaster. She lunged forward, straining violently against the iron grip of the detectives holding her arms. Her face contorted into a twisted mask of desperate, furious entitlement. "I gave you life!" Beatrice screamed, her voice tearing brutally through the silent ballroom. "You owe me! You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Tell them to stop right now. Tell them it is all a terrible misunderstanding. You owe me everything." I stepped down from the presentation stage, moving with slow, deliberate grace, closing the distance between us. The police officers tensed their hands, dropping to their belts, but I held up a single hand, signaling I was not a threat. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I looked her up and down, taking in the heavy metal handcuffs, the ruined hair, the absolute undeniable panic radiating from her eyes. I felt a profound, immovable calm settle over my entire body. The fear she used to instill in me was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. "You gave me an allergy attack and a mop," I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal clear precision. I let the words hang in the heavy air, ensuring every single investor rival and socialite in the room heard exactly how the great Beatrice Thorne had truly treated her youngest daughter. I stared her dead in the eyes, reaching in and mentally stripping away the very last ounce of power she thought she held over me. I wanted her to know that her empire was gone and I was the one wearing the crown. I gave myself a corporate empire. I continued, leaning in slightly so she could see the absolute zero of my empathy. "Have fun in federal prison." Beatrice opened her mouth to scream again, but the breath simply hitched and died in her throat. She finally saw the cold, hard truth staring back at her. There was no obedient daughter left to manipulate. The detectives jerked her backward, roughly, physically cutting off her final protest. "Move," the lead officer commanded, shoving Donovan forward. The procession of ruin began. Donovan, Beatrice, and Felicity were frog marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. The 500 elite guests, the exact people who had eagerly kissed their rings just an hour ago, now lined the path like a gauntlet of supreme judgment. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the scuff of the Thorns' stumbling shoes and the loud, disgusted mutters from their former friends. People physically turned their backs as the family passed by. As the police detail reached the main lobby, the heavy exterior glass doors were thrown wide open. A massive sea of flashing lights exploded into the dark foyer. The local news stations, tipped off by the massive police presence and the leaked financial documents, had descended on the museum steps in droves. Dozens of cameras fired off in rapid succession, strobe lighting the disgraced family in harsh, unforgiving white bursts. Reporters shouted aggressive questions, thrusting microphones over the strict police barricades. The Thorne family was shoved out into the freezing night air, completely blinded by the camera flashes. They bowed their heads, trying uselessly to hide their faces from the lenses marching directly into their total, highly publicized ruin. I stood alone in the center of the quiet ballroom, my chin held high, watching the heavy doors slowly swing shut behind them. I walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. A stunned catering manager stood frozen near the exit, holding a silver tray with a single crystal flute of vintage champagne. I took it, offering him a polite nod, and pushed open the heavy museum doors. The freezing night air whipped around me as I stepped out onto the grand stone portico. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the museum steps, casting long, sharp shadows across the crimson event carpet. The paparazzi were in an absolute frenzy, shouting aggressive questions as the Thorne family was systematically loaded into the back of separate police vehicles. Dozens of cameras fired off in rapid succession, capturing every humiliating angle of their profound downfall. Beatrice was actively resisting, her once immaculate hair now a wild, frizzy halo, the delicate shoulder strap of her custom designer gown completely torn. A female officer placed a firm hand on the back of her head, shoving her unceremoniously toward the dark, cramped back seat of the cruiser. My mother caught sight of me standing at the top of the stairs, perfectly composed, the champagne flute resting lightly in my hand. Her eyes widened with absolute venomous hatred, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne. The bubbles were crisp and cold against my tongue. I lowered the crystal glass and raised my voice, ensuring it carried perfectly over the chaotic din of the camera shutters and the wailing sirens. "Hey, Mom!" I called out, my tone dripping with cheerful, razor-sharp mockery. "I hear the prison cafeteria gets really messy. Quit being dramatic, get in the kitchen and clean." Beatrice shrieked a raw, guttural sound of pure impotent fury, but the heavy cruiser door slammed shut with a definitive thud, cutting her off completely. I watched the taillights disappear down the avenue, taking the toxic remnants of my childhood away forever. Time is the ultimate judge, and it moved swiftly to deliver exactly what the Thorne family deserved. The subsequent federal trials were a relentless, highly televised spectacle serving as a complete and public dismantling of their fraudulent empire. 6 months later, Beatrice and Donovan Thorne were stripped of their sprawling luxury estates, their hidden offshore accounts, and their carefully cultivated high society standing. They traded their tailored Italian suits and custom Valentino gowns for bleak, ill-fitting khaki prison jumpsuits. Donovan, once the terrifying titan of the financial sector who could ruin a man with a single phone call, was reduced to sweeping the damp concrete floors of a maximum security cell block for 30 cents an hour. Beatrice was stationed exactly where she belonged, scrubbing burnt grease off industrial baking pans in the noisy, chaotic federal penitentiary cafeteria, her manicured hands permanently ruined and blistered by harsh chemical soap. Felicity's descent was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. With DeAndre serving a 20-year sentence for wire fraud and their assets entirely seized by the federal government to pay back the stolen pension funds, she was left with absolutely nothing. The woman who had built her entire identity on mocking the working class was forcefully violently into their ranks. I recently drove past a dingy 24-hour diner on the outskirts of the city. Through the grease-stained front window, I saw her. She was wearing a cheap synthetic polyester uniform that smelled permanently of stale French fries, her hair tied back in a mandatory messy net. She was aggressively scrubbing a sticky vinyl booth, while a grumpy trucker snapped his fingers at her, loudly demanding a refill on his black coffee. She looked exhausted, broken, and entirely ordinary. She was finally living the miserable, invisible life she had always tried to force upon me. While their world burned to ashes, my empire soared into the stratosphere. Vanguard's highly publicized collapse left a massive void in the market, one that my legitimate, fiercely transparent architectural design firm effortlessly filled. Without my family's shadow blocking my light, we secured 3 major international contracts within a single quarter, moving our expanding headquarters to a towering state-of-the-art skyscraper right in the heart of the financial district. I no longer operated in the background. I was the name everyone wanted in their boardroom. The true victory, however, was not just financial. It was the absolute unshakable peace I had finally secured for myself. I sat in a sunlit corner cafe near my new office, laughing freely. Across the small wooden table sat Dr. Mitchell. He had been a steady, grounding presence during the chaotic legal fallout of the gala, the only person who had looked at me with genuine, uncomplicated care rather than calculated interest. He reached across the table, his warm hand covering mine, his eyes crinkling at the corners, as he delivered a wonderfully terrible medical pun. There was no manipulation, no hidden agenda, just pure supportive affection. I squeezed his hand back, my heart feeling remarkably light, finally allowing myself to trust the warmth in his gaze. Later that evening, I stood on the sprawling wrap-around terrace of my new penthouse. The air was crisp, carrying the faint electric hum of the city far below. The skyline glittered with millions of brilliant lights stretching out endlessly into the dark, limitless horizon. I rested my hands on the cool glass barrier. I had spent my entire childhood locked in a dark, suffocating basement, conditioned by cruel people, to believe I was nothing more than an ugly, disposable liability. I had been told I was worthless, socially unfit, and entirely unlovable. They had tried to bury me beneath their greed and their lies, completely unaware that I was a seed. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, cold air. I looked out over the sprawling empire I had built with my own 2 hands forged in the fires of their betrayal. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the victim. I was completely free, infinitely powerful, and utterly untouchable. The most profound lesson from Gwen's journey is that true empowerment requires walking away from toxic validation. For years, she was manipulated by the exact people who should have protected her. Her ultimate victory wasn't merely exposing her family's crimes. It was realizing her inherent worth was never defined by their cruelty. By severing those destructive ties and independently building her own corporate empire, she transformed her deepest wounds into unshakable armor. We cannot always control how others treat us, but we absolutely control what we accept. Defend your peace and step away from relationships that drain your spirit. Share your boundary-setting experiences and comment below.